This is the title of my talk, The Cultural Lives of Dolphins. This is who I am, Luke Rendall. And if you're interested in anything I say, you can follow me on Twitter and maybe get interested in other stuff. So, when I use the word culture in this title, okay, I'm not talking about opera and fine art and things like this. If you look around you now in your environment right now, okay, there are lots of things that are made by people, okay? In fact, everything that you see right now is made by people because we're enclosed in a room. But none of that is encoded in our DNA, okay? The information required to construct this lecture theatre and the equipment in it is nowhere to be found in our genome, okay? It comes from an inheritance of knowledge and skill that is built up over generations, okay? And it's what has given us our modern technology and many of the things in our modern society that have actually led us to have such an impact on the planet as well. And this process is something that sort of fascinated me as an academic. Where did it come from? And one of the things that I have spent a lot of time in my career working on is trying to understand how this kind of process of individuals learning information from each other and passing it on through populations and across generations, the roles that that kind of process is playing in non-human societies as well. Okay? So when I talk about culture, this is what I mean. Okay? Even information or behaviour that's shared by a community and that is transmitted by social learning. Social learning just means that you're learning from someone else, right? You're not sitting by yourself and figuring something out. Someone's giving you some instruction, or you're watching them and you're learning from them that way. So it is shared behaviour. We all share aspects of our culture, and this, you know, to be cultural, something has to spread by social learning, so it has to be shared. And my colleague and I, Hal Whitehead, have spent a lot of time over the last sort of 10 years pulling together evidence to support what we think, which is that in some species of whale and dolphin, this process, this learning of information, transmitting it within populations and across generations, is actually vital. Okay, to the extent that in some species, at least, young whales or dolphins cannot actually fully develop and become fully realised members of their society without this kind of inheritance, without what you learn from your life. Okay. So we're largely going to be talking about this creature up here. The bottlenose dolphin. It's not actually, I have to confess, a species that I've done a lot of primary research on myself, so I'm going to be talking about a lot of other people's work, but I'll pop up in a couple of slides, don't worry. And I also put a picture of a killer whale on my title slide, and we'll briefly discuss those animals as well, because, you know, they're super cool, and technically they are still dolphins, so I'm going to take advantage of that. But the dolphins that we have off the coast here and that motivated this whole day are these guys, the Tersiops truncatus, they're known here. Our understanding of them in terms of one species or multiple species is a very rapidly evolving one, but they're certainly very, very closely related wherever they are around the world. And this map sort of shows a kind of heat map of where you can expect to find these animals in the world, and you can see that they are largely concentrated around coastal areas. They go into land, but also that they're everywhere. Virtually every bit of coastline, no matter what form it takes, the ecology of the place has to some degree or other been colonised by these bottlenose dolphins. We know a lot about some of their societies and some of their places. Two principal study areas have been Sarasota Bay in Florida and Shark Bay in Western Australia, and these individuals have spent decades now monitoring and learning about these particular populations. For example, if you make a social network, which is basically a way of representing all the social relationships, how strong they are and how connected they are within that population of the Shark Bay bottlenose dolphin population, then you get something that looks like this. Okay, and it looks like a big mess, right? And there's no particular structure there. These animals are very gregarious, and they hang out with other members of their population in a very loose way. It's what we call fission fusion. So they're all joining up, making small groups, going away. Except for male bottlenose dolphins in some populations, which form these very strong alliances. and we will return to those in a minute. Okay, so we're going to talk now about how this culture has kind of manifested in dolphin societies in two main ways. One is this idea of foraging traditions, and then I'll talk a little bit again about alliances and how actually the evolution of alliances might be one of the ways which have allowed dolphins to learn things in this way, this cultural way, and therefore become as ubiquitous around the world as they actually have. Right? And you might think dolphins eat fish and that's the end of the story, okay? But actually, as we've learned more about different populations of dolphins in different places, we've come to appreciate that there's actually a huge diversity in foraging tactics in these animals. These words: beaching, kerplunking, mudring, feeding, hydroplaning, bottom grubbing, sponging, cuttlefish processing. I'll just explain a few of those, okay? So the first one is this cuttlefish processing, which happens in the Upper Spencer Gulf in southern Australia, and this is just a few stills of this going on. You can see the sort of tentacles of the poor cuttlefish sticking outside its mouth there, and this was reported in 2009 as a very complicated sequence of actions that the animals would do to process this cuttlefish. There's two reasons why you don't want to eat an unprocessed cuttlefish. One is it has an ink sac, which is a predator defense, but also a predator deterrent, because the ink itself is an irritant to the digestive system. And it also has a cuttlebone, which is just a big lump of sort of chalky calcium stuff that you just don't want to eat. What these dolphins will do is they come to this place, this gulf, where there are massive spawning aggregations of cuttlefish every year. And they will take a cuttlefish and they will beat it on the bottom until it's dead, and then it's not going to resist the rest of the processing. Then they bring it up into the water column again, and they vigorously shake it such that the ink sac breaks and the ink disperses into the water. That's what you can see happening in these two pictures. Okay. And there's no picture of this, but then they flip it on its back, push it down on the bottom again, and rub it on its back where the skin is thinnest until the skin goes, and then the cuttlebone is exposed, and they keep rubbing and the cuttlebone goes, and then they're left with something you can eat. Right? So that's a complicated series of actions. How did these animals learn that that was the sequence that you had to do in order to be able to eat the cuttlefish and take advantage of this? We don't. This is really tantalizing. We don't know much more about it, but I'm willing to bet that it was a process of culture. Okay. Let's play you a video that I've shamelessly stolen from the BBC of something called mud ring feeding, which happens in Cedar Key in Florida. This animal is hitting the bottom with its tail and causing this sort of wall of mud to be generated behind it. It then swims in a circle, and what it's done is created a kind of chamber with opaque walls. It's not alone. This is a collaborative foraging strategy. When that chamber closes, the fish that are enclosed in it start to panic and they start jumping out, and that's what happens. They just catch fish out of the air. I hope you can appreciate immediately that it's an extremely sophisticated way to use the environment to your advantage in order to literally have your food jumping into your mouth. And this is the paper that originally reported that, this is a paper that was published just this year, describing this in some detail. Okay, and these authors made very specific points that, similar to many specialized dolphin foraging strategies, we suggest that social learning and cultural transmission likely play a significant role in this feeding strategy. We have documented calves in close proximity to their mother as she participates in mud ring feeding, and individual juveniles that appear to be practicing making these mud rings or horseshoe shapes when there's no fish present, right? So there's obviously a learning process involved in developing this technique. And they've also observed juvenile groups attempting to mud ring feed, but scientists speak, it appeared that it was unperfected and the fish tended to jump out of the water in non-directional movements. Okay? So it's actually quite a skillful process, and it takes some degree of investment in learning to do that. And as soon as you have something like that, then you immediately set the scene for it being advantageous to speed up that learning by copying others or by learning from others. So perhaps the most famous example I'll talk about is this behaviour here called sponging, and this happens in Shark Bay in Western Australia, where for a long time people noticed that some of the dolphins there would often be seen carrying sponges on their nose. These are dead sponges, conical sponges that they picked up from the bottom. We now understand that these animals use the sponges as kind of nose guards in order to go down to the bottom of the bay and be able to root out fish that are hiding in the seabed substrate without risking injury, because some of them have venomous spines and things like that, and you just don't want to get stuck in your nose. So it's a kind of nose guard for being able to ferret around. And the scientists there have spent a lot of time and effort painstakingly tracking this behaviour through the population and just showing that it cannot be explained by any kind of genetic inheritance. It's just that the pattern of animals that do it and the pattern of animals that don't do it and who their mothers were tell us that there's no way that this can be a sort of genetically inherited behaviour. In fact, there are two places in Shark Bay where it's done, by Monkey Maya, which is labelled NM in this map, and then this other place called Useless Loop, which is labelled UL. And there appear to be two separate, what we call matrilines, which is kind of female lineages that engage in this behaviour, right? And they're not related at all. And so you can only really, and they're also living in amongst a population where there's lots of other animals that don't do this behaviour. Okay, so there's a kind of subsection of the population which engages in this particular behaviour, and it seems like the most obvious explanation is that they learn it from their mothers, right? When they are young dolphins and they're swimming around in what we call infant position, so right beside their mother, they're seeing what they're doing. And they, much like the juvenile dolphins that were practicing the mud ring feeding, they start to invest their learning in that particular technique. Sometimes this can happen in response to things that we do. Okay, so this is a story that comes from Moreton Bay in eastern Australia, where for a long time there's been these boats trawling for shrimp, so dragging a net across the bottom of the sea. When it does that, obviously it's not just the shrimp that get disturbed, everything gets kicked up into the water column, and it's a big confusing mess for all the animals that are there, and that makes it easy for dolphins like these guys to come in and feed off these things that have been chucked up in the water column. That's what these animals are doing here. They're following the trawler at roughly where the trawl is actually hitting the bottom. That's what they're following. And the interesting thing is that, although what this map shows, the white dots and black dots are dolphins that do and do not engage in this sort of trawler feeding activity, and there's no geographic separation between them at all, they're just completely merged. When you look at the social structure, which is what this tree is telling you, okay, just how closely related, how closely bonded, how good friends two animals are, is shown by how close they are on this tree. There's a very clear and dramatic distinction between dolphins that do this trawling behaviour and dolphins that don't. Okay? So by introducing this fishery into this bay, we introduced a different ecological opportunity. Some individuals learned to do that, and that transmitted through the population to some degree, but some individuals did not. And that process started to actually impact the social structure, so that the two parts of the population became increasingly socially divided. Right? Now this turned out not to be a fixed effect, because a few years ago trawling was actually stopped for conservation reasons, or drastically reduced because it's a pretty destructive fishery. And this is what the social network looked like while trawling was going on. These were all the animals that fed behind the trawlers, and they were all buddies with each other, hung out a lot. And there was only one or two animals that had anything to do with the other guys. We don't like them. They didn't do the same thing. After the trawling was stopped, that social network started to actually reform and become more homogeneous. Okay, in fact, over here are three animals, only one of which did the trawling behaviour that are now kind of become best buds and hang out a lot. So that's a nice story about how people come together again. But the point here is that the way that the animals are making their living, what they're doing to get their food, is impacting the social structure of the population. And in a way, that kind of mirrors the way that a lot of our social networks probably revolve around our work. Okay, the last example I wanted to talk about here was this thing called cooperative fishing, which is a really unique example of how humans and animals can sometimes work together to harvest the ocean. It probably occurs in more places than this, but these are the two places where it's been best documented. One is in Myanmar, or what used to be called Burma, in the pronunciation's going to be pretty bad here, but the Ayeyarwady River, okay, and there's a river dolphin that lives there, and that's what that picture here is. And perhaps the most famous example is in a place called Laguna in Brazil, where these guys get these nets, and the dolphins actually come and herd fish towards the fishermen that are standing there with their nets waiting for them, and then give specific behaviours that signal to the fishermen this is when you should throw your nets. So the dolphins are very good at herding the fish, but it's still pretty hard for them to go and take individual ones out of the shoal. But when fishermen throw their net, some of the fish get caught in the net, and that makes the fishermen happy. And some of the fish get separated into, they lose the coherence of their shoal and become much easier for the dolphins to then pick off themselves. So it's a kind of mutually beneficial thing that depends on being able to, each party being able to understand what the other one is doing. And this has been transmitted over multiple generations on both the human side and on the dolphin side as well. So it's been going on for quite a while. I've got a little clip of video that a Brazilian student, Natalia Serva, was kind enough to show me, where you can kind of see it happening. The dolphin is going to be pretty quick. You'll see a dolphin here swimming around. And one guy's already cast his net there, and there's another net going in. This one is going to show you very quickly. You'll see a dolphin here. These are videos taken by a drone. You'll see a dolphin do what's called a head slap, where they lift their head out of the water and then slap, and that's one of the signals that the fishermen should throw their nets, and you'll see that one does exactly that. Okay. So there's the dolphin, there's the head slap, and then there's the net being thrown. And just like with the trawler dolphins, this has had impact on the social structure. So in this is again a social network diagram, so the lines between them represent the strength of the bond between the individuals. And the big dots are basically animals that engage in the cooperative fishing. And you can see that they all cluster out on one side of the social network. And what my colleagues here did was looked at how this network changes when they're actually involved in the cooperative fishing, and not surprisingly, when that's going on, all the cooperative dolphins are very, very tightly associated. They spend a lot of time. This is what happens when they are foraging, but it's not using the cooperative fishermen. And here, they're still all hanging out together, and this is what happens when there's no foraging going on at all. They're just socializing or traveling or resting. But this pattern of the animals that do the cooperative feeding, hanging out together, actually remains robust throughout that. Okay? So again, you've got this example of different bits of the population engaging in different practices, and that being reflected in the social structure. Okay? And we think that this process is actually one which, if you continue long enough, okay, you end up evolving actual separation in terms of ecotypes, or maybe even actual species. So the learning process, the cultural learning and transmission of particular feeding techniques can actually feed all the way through the processes of separation and even speciation. It also has impacts. So the previous one, in the trawler dolphins, you could see that they were all sharing the same bay. In the case of the cooperative fishing, on this map here, the blue is the kind of main home ranges of the animals that engage in the fishing activity, and the red is the ranges of the animals that do not. And you can see that the animals that engage in it are really concentrated on this area, and these are the spots where the cooperative fishing principally occurs. All right? And so they really stay there, while the other ones are much wider ranging. So it also can influence the habitat use of the dolphins, okay? And it can then change how you might want to think about managing that area, and what is the important habitat for the different groups of dolphins, the different segments of the population. Okay, so how is it that dolphins are able to do this? Okay, for a long time it was thought that cultural transmission was pretty unique to humans. It was part of what made our societies what they are, part of what made us human. Everyone has a culture that they belong to and a bunch of things that are inherited as part of that. But the basic sort of building block of cultural transmission is this idea of imitation, okay, and copying others. So, young children, if you've got any young children in your lives, or you were a young child once, all of us, they will spontaneously engage in copying of whatever their parents do, right? So everyone's got a story of something to do with a child spontaneously copying, whether they're trying to shave when their dad's shaving, or this kind of thing. And that's thought in human development to underpin all the kind of cultural transmission that follows that process. It's been known for some time that bottlenose dolphins have a pretty strong ability to imitate as well. This was first reported in quite an amusing story by these South African authors in 1973, when back in the day it was okay, they were sort of watching and observing dolphin behaviour through an aquarium window, and in those days, in the 70s, it was fine to just smoke as much as you wanted in a small confined space, and that's what this guy's doing here. He's having a cheeky cigarette while the dolphin is watching. This is a young calf who at the time was lactating, was still dependent on its mother's milk. And when the calf saw this smoke being exhaled, it went back to its mum, got a mouthful of milk, and came back up to the window and exhaled that milk to reproduce the cloud of smoke that it had seen coming from the human. And this was striking enough to these scientists that they made a lot of effort to draw it out. But it's just kind of one sort of story. This has been studied systematically more recently, and this is a really great study led by Kelly Jackler, and the pictures are not terribly clear, but what these guys are doing was actually putting little suction cups over the eyes of the dolphins, right? And then telling them to copy either a human or another dolphin in what it was doing. And it turns out that you think that the basis of imitation is being able to see what is going on so that you can reproduce it and copy it yourself. But it turns out they have a very flexible strategy for doing that. Not only do they use visual cues, but they use acoustic cues. And in most of the behaviours, when it was copying another dolphin, the dolphin that had no vision, that had its eyes cut, was able to simply listen to the sound that the particular behaviour of the other dolphin was making, and figure out from that what it had to do. Okay? Whereas when it came to the humans, what they would do is then dip their head under water and echolocate. And so they would get information about what the human was doing by echolocating on it. The person as they were doing what they're doing, and they would learn, okay, I have to copy that behaviour. So they could do it visually, they could do it by listening, and they could do it by actively echolocating as well, which sort of speaks to a very competent and flexible strategy for imitating. So I think that the basis of this actually comes from this alliance formation behaviour that we see in male bottlenose dolphins. This is best documented in Shark Bay in Western Australia, where males will form alliances. They will form very strong social bonds, and they'll hang out most of the time together. And the purpose of doing that is to fend off other alliances, and also to essentially sequester and harass females until they get mating opportunities. Okay, you know, we all love a good dolphin, but they can behave in ways that we would regard as reprehensible as well. So one of the striking things about this alliance behaviour is it is characterised by an extreme form of synchrony, of actually animals doing the same thing at the same time. And this was sort of analysed in some detail by Richard Connor and his colleagues, where they took video of these animals doing this kind of synchronised behaviour, and I'll show you some video in a minute. And they particularly looked at the surfacing behaviour, right? So they come up together at the same time. And they videoed this behaviour with a camera that operated at 60 frames per second, and then they went back and frame by frame analysed how many frames between one animal surfacing and the next animal surfacing. Okay? And when this was happening in between alliance members, then on average it was about 8 frames, right? The difference between the leader and the follower. You had to take it down to the level where you could examine things at the scale of 1/6 of a second before you could actually see which animal was leading. So an incredible degree of synchrony. That's showing those numbers there. So I'll give you a couple of videos just to show examples of this. Okay, I think you'll hear Richard being excited about it as well. This is a synchronized leap, actually.
Wow, sync leap. How cool is that?
Yeah, very. These are not trained animals, right? This is just occurring naturally in the wild. It looks like a dolphinarium show, but it's not. And here, so the next one is a series of shots of what's called, I think he calls it roostering, where the dolphins swim in a sort of exaggerated way with their nose out of the water. You'll see that. There's one animal. And there's this alliance partner. So, yeah, you really see that and you think, well, the animals have been trained to do that. They must have been trained to do that. But that's just occurring naturally in the wild, and they're sort of mirroring each other's movements all the time. So to be able to do that, they must be able to watch what the other dolphin is doing and copy that behaviour almost immediately as it's happened, right? And that's probably the basis for the imitative capacity that the whole species has, is whatever drove that degree of synchrony. It's clearly a signal, right? You don't swim around like that with your nose out of the water doing this kind of synced stuff for no reason. It's a signal to each other that, like, we're like that, and we're really tight. And it's also a signal to anyone else who's watching, like, don't mess with us. We're literally that tight. We do this all the time when military parades have people marching in perfect synchrony. It just seems to work as a signal there as well. But it's not just the males that have this kind of propensity for copying. So this was a recent piece of work that I was involved in with a really nice story about a female bottlenose dolphin, confusingly called Billy, because they didn't know she was female when they gave her the name. But this is a story that spans sort of 30 years, really. Billy was in the 1980s taken into captivity temporarily because she was found in a pretty poor condition. She'd actually come through a set of locks and was found inside a harbour, kind of trapped. And she was taken in and rehabilitated in a dolphinarium where she was co-housed with the dolphins that were there permanently. And those dolphins had been trained, and they were regularly asked to perform a show, and part of that show was this thing called tail walking, where the animal shows sort of just how strong it is in the water.